early 1991, Street Fighter II launched in arcades and changed the landscape of competitive gaming forever. It would usher in the golden age of the fighting game genre and caused a flood of new titles to be produced. Throughout the early 1990s, many video game publishers and developers attempted to cash in on this new popularity, and Capcom was no exception, putting out additional fighting titles alongside its Street Fighter series like the gothic horror-based Darkstalkers and the Marvel-licensed X-Men Children of the Atom. They weren't done there though, as they would later attempt to create a new game that blended the 2D fighting of Street Fighter II with one of Japan's most popular entertainment themes, the Mecha genre. This new title would be called Cyberbots: Full Metal Madness and would hit arcades in the mid-90s. While many people outside of Japan are more familiar with Cyberbots through its characters' inclusions in other Capcom games like Marvel vs. Capcom, the game grew a niche passionate following in its native country, and people were enamored with some of the new gameplay ideas it introduced. Cyberbots was not a completely original game, however, but a spin-off to an early arcade game released a year prior. An arcade game that featured large mechanical suits in a war-torn, futuristic setting. In 1994, Capcom would release a brand new beat-em-up game in arcades called Armored Warriors. Over in Japan, it would have a much longer title and be known as Power Gear Strategic Variant Armor Equipment. The game would be directed by Yoshiki Okamoto, who had previously worked on games like 1942, Gunsmoke, and Final Fight. Kinu Nishimura would handle its character designs, while Haruki Suetsugu, often credited as Sensei, handled the mecha designs. Nishimura is probably known best these days for her art from Capcom's Versus series and designing the characters for the first two Zero Escape titles. In a plot that takes some nods from the Mobile Suit Gundam series, the game takes place in the distant future of 2282, with the Earth United Government attempting to bring the Principalities of Raya under its control after their capital is attacked by a group of cyborgs declaring war on Raya. Players could choose between 4 separate characters that each piloted their own unique massive mecha called a Variant Armor, or VA for short. Jeff Perkins pilots the AEX-10M Blodia, Ray Turner the SVA-6L Reptos, Glenn Reed the AEX-10H Golden, and Sarah White the AEX-12J40. The game allowed for up to 3 simultaneous players to battle their way through 7 different levels filled with rampant enemy soldiers and mecha. While making your way through these levels, certain parts can be knocked off of enemies and then picked up and augmented to the player's own VA, giving them access to new weapons, attacks, and abilities. Special Mega Crush moves can be utilized by pressing 2 buttons simultaneously and will deplete the player's health bar by an amount depending on which move they use. Characters can also team up Voltron style at some points to create a massive variant armor that is only usable for a short amount of time, but deals out massive damage. Armored Warriors would not see any official home ports until over 2 decades after its initial launch in 1994. It would release first on Retrobit's Super Retrocade in late 2017, and then appeared in the Capcom Beat-em-up bundle for PCs and home consoles in 2018. The title unfortunately only found moderate success and got lost in the shuffle of countless other arcade games. The following year though, a spin-off to the game would be released. This new title would ditch both the name and genre of its predecessor, and instead take more inspiration from Capcom's Golden Goose, Street Fighter II. Cyberbots: Full Metal Madness would hit arcades around the world in 1995, a year after Armored Warriors had launched. Instead of being a beat-em-up though, this new title would embrace the now incredibly popular fighting genre and featured one-on-one 2D combat similar to Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat. With this switch to a new genre and a new name, Kinu Nishimura would return as the game's character designer to create a brand new vibrant cast of unique variant armor pilots. From the impish Princess Devilet and gallant Gawain Murdoch, to the modest Arietta and proud Santana Lawrence, Cyberbots had a very diverse crew of interesting characters. While Cyberbots did see arcade releases outside of Japan, they were incredibly limited and sadly did not find much success. Its main and most well-known character was the hot-blooded Jin Saotome. Many fans learned about the title through Jin's inclusion on the playable rosters of the first two Marvel vs. Capcom games. This was similar to how many people outside of Japan learned about the Fire Emblem series through Marth and Roy's appearances in Nintendo's Super Smash Bros. Melee. Even though Cyberbots received an entirely new cast of characters, all 4 of its VAs would return in this new title, but with a slight twist. Players would first select one of 6 characters, which would determine how the game's storyline would unfold. They would then choose which variant armor they wanted to pilot. These VAs would be split into 4 different types, with each being based around one of the original mecha found in Armored Warriors: Blodia, Reptos, 40, and Golden. Players would then choose from 3 different variants of the selected VA, which would determine how it would play and what moves and abilities it had. There were different secret button combinations that could be put in after you made your selection to play as 4 of the boss VAs that were normally inaccessible. The gameplay would feel very familiar to those that had played other previous Capcom fighters, but added in a few unique and interesting features. Players would now have to keep their eye on many separate gauges that would have specific cooldown times and shield levels. The first of these was the boost gauge. Pressing the boost button would allow your variant armor to move faster and utilize certain movement abilities. When this gauge ran out, players would have to wait for it to recharge again. The weapon gauge let your VA use its unique weapon attack like a missile launcher or laser cannon. These would have a brief cooldown period represented on the gauge before they could be used to attack again. The arm gauge would slowly deplete when taking consecutive damage from an opponent, and if it ran out, your VA's main arm weapon would fall to the ground, leaving you with weaker and less effective attacks. This was comparable to becoming dizzy in Street Fighter II after taking too many successive hits. Thankfully, your VA could pick up and reattach the arm when close to it. Finally, the power gauge would let players deal extra damage when it filled up, as well as allow them to execute 2 types of super attacks. A Giga Crush, which was often used as more of an evasive type of move, allowing you to gain brief invincibility and escape from an opponent's onslaught of attacks, and a Cyber EX, an extremely powerful attack that can deal massive damage. Cyberbots found enough success in Japanese arcades to receive ports to both the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation 2 years later in 1997. These ports would include 3 new selectable characters and full voice acting. An additional variant armor could also be unlocked called Zero Goki, known as Zero Akuma overseas, that was modeled after the popular Street Fighter character and even kept much of his moveset intact. The title would never receive any home ports outside of Japan until 14 years later, when it finally got an untranslated PS1 Japan imports version on Sony's PlayStation Network in 2011. A decade later, the arcade version would make its way to Nintendo's Switch console as part of the Capcom Arcade Stadium Retro Collection in 2021. While Cyberbots never saw any sequels or spin-offs, Capcom remained fond of its characters in Mecha over the years, including them in many of their later titles. Jin Saotome would obviously go on to join the rosters of the first 2 Marvel vs. Capcom games, and his Blodia variant armor would be playable in 1998's Techromancer arcade game, which was later ported to the Dreamcast. Princess Devilet surprisingly made even more appearances in Capcom games than Jin. She was a playable character in Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, its mobile-only sequel Puzzle Fighter, and in 2012's Project X Zone for the 3DS. She also appeared as a support character in the original Marvel vs. Capcom. The cast of Cyberbots later showed up as a collection of special costumes in Street Fighter V, and made some brief cameos in Tatsunoko vs. Capcom. Both Armored Warriors and Cyberbots unfortunately never captured a large enough audience to expand out into any more titles. Capcom thankfully has not let these games become completely forgotten though, and these days they are more accessible to people around the world than ever before. Maybe someday Cyberbots will make its glorious return and let players once again step into the pilot seat of their favorite variant armor. Hey, thanks a lot for watching all the way to the end. There's not a lot to say about this video outside of I've just kind of always been enamored with Jin, Princess Devilet, and the entire Cyberbots cast. And I just thought it would be cool to kind of take a look at it, kind of see where it came from and see, how the characters were used in other Capcom games. And it was a fun video to make. Also, I'd love to hear more from you guys in the comments. I think half the reason I make these videos in the first place is just for an excuse to talk to people about gaming topics that interest me. So I hope you enjoyed the video and look forward to more soon. Thanks. Bye.